can hear me. I flipped the switch on. You guys hear me okay in the back there? Perfect. It's funny how like sometimes the audio will be better in the back and not the front. So I did have a prepared talk for you, but I'm also super flexible. So, and I was excited to learn that there's a lot of people in this room that actually come from different majors. Like, so a lot of times I'll, sit at or be invited to speak to people that are in the business school, like ready to be entrepreneurs and ready to go into business. And so it's not very often that I get to see this really cross-functional kind of, really diverse group of people that are coming from a lot of different departments. So really quickly, raise your hand if you're from the business school. If you're getting a business degree, okay, probably about a third. Engineering sciences, okay. Humanities, liberal arts. What am I forgetting? Just shout it out. Did I cover them all? Okay, well, that's very good. Okay, awesome. Well, actually, the longer I go in my career, the more I appreciate that there's actually elements of all of that in my career. Right? I used to be one of those hardcore, I'm going to get a STEM degree, go into engineering, I'm very tunnel vision. And the further I got in my career, I started to appreciate more and more aspects of, how do you think about business? How do you build teams? How do you think about influencing people, right? And, the humanities, we spend a lot of time thinking about social sciences and how to get teams to work more productively. And a lot of that is a lot of psychology, a lot of social sciences, and kind of the art of influencing people. So after I left patent law, which is very, I don't know, do any of you know patent attorneys? Have any of you ever met a patent attorney? I really don't have a personality of a patent attorney. So I spent about...
What is that personality?
Well, there's a few types of attorneys out there, and patent attorneys, they're trying to protect inventions, right? So a lot of times they're working with inventors to get disclosures and understand, is something new or novel, unique, has it ever been invented before? And then you spend a lot of time kind of working by yourself, like in an office, behind a computer, not talking to people. And so I spent about 10 years doing that, and I realized, I kind of have this skill set that needs, this team interaction. I really need to not be working by myself. Some people are phenomenal at it. They love it. They actually don't want people to bother them, and they are just happy as clams. So there's a great personality set that works for patent attorneys, and I kind of learned everything I needed to know about patent law and then just decided it was time to move on and learn some other things. So I'm super happy I did. When you heard my career path, it's really confusing to people. They're like, well, how did you go from being a patent attorney to my next thing after that was running a video production team, right? I had no background in video production. I actually didn't want to do law. That's actually why I left. I said, you know what? Here's this opportunity to go and learn something totally different that I've never done before. And it's an opportunity to just kind of roll up my sleeves, get in on the ground floor, and just learn something new. And I spent a lot of time in my career trying to be the best. I tried, get the best grades, be top of my class, like all of that stuff. And it was an opportunity to kind of leave my ego behind and realize, like, I knew nothing about video production, nothing. Like, I was totally beholden to these people around me, these experts around me that had to spend their time and patience teaching me how do I produce great video, right? And they were really great to mentor me. But I didn't have like a degree to sit on. I didn't have like great grades to be like, I'm the best, I'm the smartest anymore. And so it was a really big lesson in humility. And how do you go into a new venture when you've spent a lot of time, like I spent 10 years in law, right? That's a lot of investment of time and energy. And everybody's like, you're crazy. Why would you leave that? But I found that the more and more I started to go and branch and learn new things, it's like, oh, okay, that's fun. I learned that. Now I want to go try something new, and I want to go learn, why don't I take over the business development team and run partnership projects, right? Everything I learned was like nothing I had ever done before. And so my whole career's been built after I left law, and after you do about 400 patents, you can kind of do them in your sleep. Everything I do now is new, right? I have never gone into a project knowing exactly what it is that I needed to do. And so I've just had to learn how to figure things out. And it's really, it's actually a really great skill set. If you can learn how to figure things out early on and not expect to be the smartest in the room from the very beginning, and just have that humility to realize like everybody around you probably has something to teach you that you can benefit from if you're just willing to be open and listen, then that's a really great skill set to have. So now that you know that I have kind of this kind of, I don't know, wonky career, I don't know how else to explain it. So we can do a few things. We could just kind of talk about, career advice that I have. I also prepared something around what it means to be an inclusive leader. I don't know that we always get enough education of that early on, and I find what happens is we work with a lot of tech CEOs and a lot of executives with Women Tech Council, and we find that they're very far in their career before they actually learn this stuff, so that might be helpful to you to run through some of the skills and some of the lessons that we tend to be teaching older, more experienced leaders that are just trying to figure it out now. And then I also have an overview of Women Tech Council if any of you are interested. So, all right, raise your hand if you want to talk about career skills in more of an open format. Okay, raise your hand if you want to talk about inclusive leadership and what that looks like. Okay, and then who wants an overview of Women Tech Council? Okay, well, you should be interested to know, we ran it just quickly. It's at the end, so if we have time, I'll just run through it. But we ran a college STEM program for women across the state last year. We had about 1,000 women participate, and one of the strongest groups actually came out of BYU. It kind of surprised me, actually. The two strongest were the University of Utah and BYU, but BYU, especially from their business school and the information system group, had a lot of women that participated, so it was really, really cool to see. Okay, so I'm just going to go here, and then of course we have the Q&A after, and if we've got time after, I'm always happy to talk about extra skills. Yes?
On the inclusive leadership thing,
yeah.
I think that one of the competencies that we don't have naturally is how to do this. And sometimes we just don't know what the questions are that we should be thinking about. So I think this is a really important topic.
Okay. Great, and just know if you've got questions as we go on, feel free to raise your hand. I tend to take a little bit more of a business approach to inclusivity, and the reason why is if you've ever done any gender research or diversity research, it's actually been researched for decades that teams that are diverse are actually more productive, drive better revenue, they operate better, right? And so you sit here and kind of think like, okay, well that's a no-brainer, right? But it is really surprising and shocking that it's still so hard to actually do, right? It's just like good leadership. Good leadership doesn't happen because you graduated from a top business school. You're not automatically a good leader. You become a good leader by learning a set of skills as you grow in your leadership skills, and you're going to make lots and lots of mistakes. You're going to look back and be like, oh my gosh, why was I so prideful? Like, why didn't I listen? Why did I always have to be the most loud person in the room, right? A lot of leaders, takes years for them to learn how to be quiet, right? And let other people talk and let other ideas take hold. Those do not come naturally to us. And so so that's why inclusion is so hard, because it's actually a skill that we're actually not born with. Well, we're born with it. Nobody's born racist. Nobody's born, automatically, hating anybody. But it's just the cultures that we grow in, right, create these social norms that are really hard, because when our brains learn that, it's hard to unlearn it. So I start with kind of the business case of diversity, because I think it's good for you to just to understand that there's, lots of great reasons from a business perspective. If a lot of you are going to be building teams, in any of your business functions, diversity is, always a great thing to try to achieve. It's not as hard as you think. You just have to be intentional and deliberate about it. So higher company earnings, higher innovation. They've tied that to if you think about patent law, right? You actually have higher innovation with diverse teams. Pro-diversity policies drive higher innovation. This is diverse management drives higher innovation as well. These are separate studies. Inclusion leads to higher talent retention. If any of you run a business, hiring great talent, it's one of the hardest things. It's actually one of the things that tech companies struggle with the most right now, is hiring great talent. And all of the turnover that happens. If you don't have a great culture, you're recycling people or cycling through, and all of that lost learning. When I was doing intellectual property law, they'd actually tell me it takes about 3.5 years for us to break even on you. to think about that. If I only stay for a year and a half or 2 years, they'll never make their money back when they hire people. So it's a real business conversation around retention. Productivity obviously increases shareholder value, drives community values, and it also can drive trade secret value as well. So they've done some studies. Oh, that doesn't really, oh, sorry about that. I don't know what's going on there. Wonder if it's the font. Oof. Alrighty, well, we'll see if your brains will map those letters. But they've done some studies that say, like, if your company, the top quartile of companies that had gender diversity were 15% more likely to have financial returns. But what's interesting is if you have racial and ethnic diversity, you have a 35% higher chance of financial returns. So I spent we started Women Tech Council 11 years ago, so we've spent a lot of time on this conversation. I was actually really surprised to see this number, right? That it actually behooves us to broaden out past just the gender conversation and toward a much more open conversation around race, right? And this is all types of diversity as well. But it's really interesting that these studies are bearing out that we live in a much more global society now, and if you can be more open to these types of diversity, your company stands to benefit. They've also studied lots of different diversity factors, how they impact innovation based on gender, age, national origin, career path, industry background, and education. So this is a great reminder that it's not just about gender, it's not just about race, it is about life experiences as well, right? There's all types of ways to be diverse. In fact, when I do trainings on inclusion and unconscious bias, we list out like 25 different ways that you can be diverse, right? And gender is only one of them, race is only one of them, right? There's all these different ways that make people unique and different. And then companies have higher innovation, higher revenues, higher earnings before interest and tax margins. So all of those benefits here. So I'm just going to flip through this really quick. More patents, greater innovation. During downturn, they have better employee engagement. Engaged employers are 6 more times likely to innovate, 6 more times likely to recruit and refer, more likely to work on high productive teams, and more likely to commit to long-term employment right now. So if any of you have been following the news at all, I call it the tech reckoning. So it's sort of tied to the Me Too movement that's happened in the media industry. But tech had its own similar timeline with Uber, with the Google Manifesto. Then we had Me Too that went viral. We had Facebook that made diversity kind of very visible in the media. And so tech has had this really interesting upheaval in the last year or so. And what we're finding is that that shareholders are becoming much less patient with the old stereotype of kind of the crazy founder who runs a crazy company and anything goes. They're getting much, much less patient. And the reason why is that they're finding with social media and with these ways for people to have a voice, that it's actually impacting their business. So investors and shareholders are starting to act more. Before they were very hands-off. They were like, okay, you do what you need to do, you're driving millions. But now they're actually getting much more active in really suggesting that companies do equal pay, demanding diversity from the executive level on down, board level on down even, removing CEOs who are deemed incompetent to handle all of these diversity and inclusion aspects. And we're seeing hints of government regulation around it. But what's interesting is if any of you do board management, it's really interesting how they work. So like the shareholders will do a proposal, right? These are like really large companies like Procter & Gamble, let's say, really large Johnson & Johnson type of companies that have thousands of shareholders. And there's this company that has really tried to enforce equal pay among these large companies. So what they do is they present a shareholder proposal that's like, the shareholders will really want you to do equal pay. And what they actually are trying to do is they're trying to get them to not vote for that. They do this negotiation behind the scenes that they actually don't want it to go to a shareholder vote. right? They're trying to get it to not go to a shareholder vote, so there's this negotiation where they hope that the CEO and the executives will just say, you know what, we actually don't want it to go to a shareholder vote, we will just take on equal pay ourselves, right? We'll invest the $10 million to do the equal pay analysis and just do it. So this is this really interesting way of board governance of how they're trying to influence executives to do equal pay and other things around diversity and inclusion. So, okay, why do we still struggle then, right? Because you think like if all the conditions, all the market conditions out there are saying, you know, you really need to be thinking about diversity and inclusion. Hopefully you care about it for the right reason, but even if you don't care about it for the right reason, your shareholders are going to care, your customers are going to care. So then why is it so hard? Well, I think there's this fundamental misunderstanding of diversity. And I think that behavioral change goes beyond just diversity. So we'll talk about that really quickly. So if you do an engram of the words diversity and inclusion, and this comes from Google Ngram, and you see over time the use of that word in literature, you see that diversity, if we look over time, started to get a big spike around the 1960s and civil rights era, right? And we see this hockey stick effect because now diversity is so important. And we see the word inclusion isn't used as often, right? So it really didn't really take off until around 1940s, 1960s, but it's kind of sort of flatlined here where if you think about all the media that you see, really you're seeing the word diversity. And I really think it's because we don't understand what inclusion looks like well enough. And so I think if we can emphasize this concept of inclusion more, then we will achieve the goals that we're striving for. If you think about this area right here, I was at a law firm around 2000-ish, right? It was diversity, diversity, diversity. But I will tell you, as a patent attorney, so you have to have a STEM degree, and then you have to have a law degree. So there's so few women that go into STEM, and then there's even fewer of those women that go into law degree. So I actually didn't have very many women patent attorneys around me at all, right? At least in tech, you have like 15 to 20% women sometimes, if you're lucky, but patent law was like very, very sparse. But I will say that this inclusion factor didn't exist for me at the law firm. I didn't feel included, right? Even though we talked about diversity a lot. And so it is, I think that is the secret. So I'm glad this quote shows up well. Okay, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. What do you guys think that looks like in a real work setting? What are some examples you can think of being invited to the party but not asked to dance? Or if you've experienced it. Yes? Okay, so he says, you might have been hired into a company that says they value diversity, and you're assuming that this person is diverse that's going into this company, right? But they're not being evaluated fairly based on the skill set that they're bringing to the company. Great example. Mm-hmm. Right, so an example of this would be you have diverse employees at your company, right? You've hired them, but you're not asking their opinions or valuing them or even what they share it. You're just dismissing them, opting for somebody else's opinion, right? So their ideas, they might be sharing them, but they're not getting to the actual influence that they could be having, right? I saw another hand over here, yes. Okay, great example. So you might think that you're doing a great job hiring diversity, but culturally on the inside, they're really not being engaged in the way that they would hope. Any other examples? Yes? Okay, so, and I like that example too. So you could be on a team, without a voice, or you could be like literally physically separated. I was talking to a female developer. We did a Women in Tech panel last week, and she said her experience at her first company, she was like in a cubicle, right, by herself, like, and this is kind of my patent law experience, right, like not engaging with anybody, not sharing ideas. And then she moved to her next company, and they did a pair programming methodology. So what that means is you've got two programmers sitting side by side, working on the same code, developing the same code every day, and you're getting that constant feedback loop, right? And she said, she's like, it made all the difference. I was going to leave programming, but then when I had that experience of collaborating and realizing that the things that my insight mattered, I decided to stay in programming. Now she's a senior programmer at her company. Yes, Steve.
It might be as simple as things like social inclusion. Do the men invite the women to lunch with them, or do they just go off and hang by themselves? Or other kinds of social opportunities.
That's a great example. So do we invite people socially? Because right, in a real business setting, a lot of real business decisions are actually being made in very social settings, right? A lot of the bonding, a lot of the opportunity deciding is happening because people feel like they want to throw great opportunities to people they know. So at the law firm, great example, all the time the guys would go around and get their group to lunch, and they'd pass my office and they'd never invite me to lunch, right? And you'd be like, oh God, like, why? Like, and then you feel like it's a total bummer, but also they're building the relationships that business decisions are based on, right? Other examples? Okay, we'll go through some others later on, but this is great. Glad you guys are getting it. Okay. So, question, can a non-diverse team be inclusive? Yeah, I mean, that's the ideal, for sure, right? Whether you have, in any group, you are going to have some amount of diversity, for sure. And that's the ideal, is that you're going to accept all those ideas. This is kind of a trick question, right? Like, you were kind of headed there, like, absolutely. If you look at a non-diverse team, like a team of all white men, they absolutely are inclusive of each other, right? Like, tech companies are created out of teams of executives of all white men all the time, and they're highly productive, right? So it's not that they don't know how to be inclusive, right? They do know how to be inclusive. They're already being inclusive with people they know, people they get along with. But it sort of looks like this. Where's my line? Oh, my line didn't show up. Okay, you're going to have to watch my laser pointer then. I don't know. I had a big red line on this graph. Okay, so this is inclusion, increases this way. Diversity increases this way. So this is the scenario I was sort of thinking of. If you kind of think of a non-diverse team, they actually can be pretty high performing, even if they don't have a lot of diversity there, right? Because they can be very inclusive. So what happens, though, is once you start including diverse elements, you tend to see a dip, which is kind of right here. So that's where you might see a tokenized minority effect if the team doesn't understand how to be inclusive to diverse elements that come in. Now, some people can, but it typically takes a level of training for people to know how to include someone that doesn't look like them, act like them, speak like them, think like them, right? So then you tend to actually have a dip. So there's this thing called the implementation dip. And if you do any change management, things typically get a little bit harder before they get better. So if you're running a team and you've got, you've sort of recognized, okay, we're going to start, growing our team and making sure that we've got lots of different diverse voices, you have to recognize that if you just leave it on its own, you're probably going to experience a dip right around here, which is where training of the whole team is very helpful, and just increasing people's awareness and understanding. And that's where really great leadership matters. But because you can reduce how low this dip goes and actually drive it towards higher performance, right? So yes, non-diverse teams can actually be very, very inclusive. But once you start going down the path of including diversity, then you've got to be just more aware. So unconscious bias is something that we talk about a lot in the business world. It's becoming more and more important. Who has had unconscious bias training in this room? Have any of you had unconscious bias training? Okay. Who wants to attempt to, well, I have a definition up here. A hidden or implicit bias is a preference for or against a person, thing, or group, and it's held at the unconscious level. And that's what's so challenging about unconscious bias. It's very unconscious, right? And everybody does this. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself, just to give you some context. So I was actually adopted from Korea. I was adopted when I was 2 years old, raised in Sandy, Utah, went to Jordan High School. Any beat diggers in here? Oh, no. Like usually there's at least one. Okay. Went to the University of Utah Engineering, went to BYU Law School. And so even though, like in my experience, people would treat me as Asian, inside I'm not Asian, right? And in fact, when I used to look at the mirror when I was a kid, I'd be like, oh my gosh, my features seem so strange to me. Because all I'm seeing, so think about how the brain works. If all I'm seeing is white on the outside, why would I assume that I should recognize Asian, right? So our brains are going to map to what we learn and our life experience. When I remember just ignorantly saying one day, well, I can't be racist. I'm Asian. How could I possibly be racist? But think about the media I was exposed to. Think about my upbringing. Think about the comments that my friend's dad was like, oh, I'd be great if she married anyone. I'm totally fine if anyone, but she just cannot marry a black man, right? So I'm hearing these things all the time growing up, just like anyone else. So unconscious bias exists with everybody, right? No matter where you're born, you're always going to get it. I just took my kids to Korea for the first time. We got back. Actually, I met my birth family for the first time in 42 years. And we got back like 2 weeks ago. And my kids, who've been raised, going to Skyline, anyone here from Skyline? Okay. Yeah, so my son goes to Skyline, right? It's kind of a white school. My other son goes to West High, so kind of, a little bit more diverse. But, they're getting that experience of seeing all Asians for the first time. And it was like they could not stop talking about it, right? Because it was so distinctly different from what they had grown up in that was so noticeably different. So unconscious bias, the thing I like to remind people is it is not a bad thing. When you hear it and people are like, oh, you should do unconscious bias training, people are like, oh no, now you've just attacked me, I'm a bad person. It has nothing to do with being wrong or right, and it has everything to do with the way we were raised, what we were exposed to, and the fact that we simply weren't exposed to the entire world, right? My exposure to India is not great. My exposure to inner city life is not great, right? And it is simply just recognizing that we lack that social understanding, that when we meet people, and we make these automatic assumptions about people, right? Because people make lots of assumptions about me just because I'm Asian, right? I don't speak Korean at all. And I speak Spanish. So it's about those assumptions that we automatically make when we meet people and taking a step back and saying, okay, so why did I think that of that person, right? Because you have about, 3 seconds to make a judgment about people, and you're making those judgments all the time, and it's based on unconscious bias. So we kind of already went over this. Our brains are pretty powerful. So there's there's this really cool test. If you've ever gone to implicit.harvard.edu and done an implicit association test, it's really surprising. Like even if I take it, I find that just because of my upbringing and, I run an organization, Women Tech Council, and I've really supported women my whole life, but there's still those things. If you just make that quick implicit judgment, the way that it has that time judgment, I will still sometimes make that association around gender, and then I'm like, horrified. or you'd be really surprised about what your brain actually automatically maps to. So this can affect, who should have a career, who should have a family, who belongs in sciences, who belongs in art, right? What the interaction between white people and black people or people with physical disabilities. So take the test, it's fun. It's just a really interesting way of understanding where your own biases might sit. And you can do it in a really safe way that, you don't have to tell anybody what the results are. So a lot of people, when they kind of think about culture, who has a definition of culture, like company culture? Like if you were to say, what is company culture, how would you define it? Yes. Okay. Okay, so an unspoken way of doing things and how you react to certain things are defined by culture, right? Great. Say that one more time, sorry. Uh-huh. Yep. So how you interact with people who are outside of your culture also is defined can be defined by your culture. Other ways of thinking about company culture. Go ahead. No, please. Okay. Yep. So what's the mood in the room? How do you interact with each other? What are maybe the overarching goals that everybody's sort of working towards that define that culture? And these are all actually correct. I mean, there's so many ways of defining culture. It is unspoken, but it can also be spoken. It can also be written. Like a lot of unconscious bias is actually written into the processes that we create. And we can say, this is how the company does it. For example, at the law firm, right, we struggled hiring women. And we used to have this rule like, okay, if you hire, so in intellectual property, because of the STEM degree, we'd say, okay, we will only hire women who have this degree, right? And then we took a step back and we said, well, wait a minute. So let's say it's litigation or some other area. Why do you have to have that degree? Because you're really actually leaving out a lot of talented people by just keeping it focused on certain degrees. And once we said, okay, wait, do we actually care what their degree is in litigation? Could they have a biology degree and sit for the patent exam and do litigation? Sure, why not, right? We just then opened ourselves up to a lot more talent. So that's an example of where unconscious bias was actually built into the recruiting processes, but they're all over the place in our companies, our organizations, in all the decisions we're making. We need to step back and say like, okay, what kind of bias might be worked in here that I'm maybe not thinking about, and then take a step back. So this is where I like to distinguish between personal bias and systemic bias. So there's a lot of situations where we personally are contributing to the bias. And then there's actually a lot of situations, and this is why you should not feel bad when you hear of unconscious bias, where it's systemic bias, where it's just something that was put in place a long time ago, it just keeps going over and over, and nobody stops to say like, hey, maybe we should change that, right? So the things that you need to recognize is where you participate in something that creates bias, or where it's something that the organization has done over time. The funny thing is that you can even create a less healthy situation, even positive bias. So a lot of people are like, but wait, like, isn't it a great thing that we just assume that Asians are really smart? And it's, you feel like, oh, well, I'm giving them a compliment. Like, Asians are really smart. They're good at math and science. So you also should be careful, right? Because if you actually look at the data, sure, there's a lot of Asian people going into engineering and, medical. But if you look at like tech, for example, and you think about the high percentage of Asians, because of any race, Asians have higher percentage in terms of the diversity data. But in leadership, it's drastically underrepresented, right? So there's this stereotype that fights against the perception of Asians in leadership. It's fine if they're engineers, it's fine if they're doctors, but like running a tech company, right? So even positive bias can actually fight against some of the goals that you're trying to achieve and some of the decision making. So here's surprising ways that men and women are the same. I like to remind people that at the end of the day, I just want the same thing as most men, right? I like opportunity, I like career advancement, I want to get paid competitively and equally, I want parental leave, and guess what? Most men want parental leave. They just won't say it, right? I did a study once, and men actually wanted it just as much as women. And flex time off, all of these things men and women actually want. So there's no downside to supporting the cultures and the things within companies that actually benefit all of us. And there's no such thing as being gender and race blind. So if we just recognize that our brains are sort of automatically always on every day, like every interaction, and they're always working, then we can move from unconscious mode to conscious mode. And that's what it takes to be inclusive, is just be very conscious about what's happening around you, how people are feeling, how they're reacting, and just be very aware around it. And that's what actually changes our behaviors. Okay, perfect, thanks. So the key is observing what's going on around us and just, being aware. Then contextualizing it and saying, okay, what do I think is happening here? Or even get feedback. So a lot of us, when we're first starting out, I actually talk to a lot of tech CEOs that are really worried about making a mistake. And I think because of that, because they're leading this company, it actually prevents a lot of them from being willing to learn. So if you can just start the practice now of saying, hey, I'm going to have a couple of trusted people within an organization that are just able to give me feedback. I want people who are going to be honest, candid with me, and give me feedback in a safe place, one-on-one, right? There's no value for public humiliation anywhere. And if we constantly are open to getting this feedback, just even starting earlier on, we're going to learn much faster what our interactions are doing to people and how people are reacting. It'll give us much better understanding of the context when we do things. And then how do we take action in the way that's appropriate, that doesn't, a lot of times we talk about ways to help people when you're observing unconscious bias happening. How do we take the action that will not make people feel defensive, but then help move toward a more productive conversation? So for example, I think I have a couple of examples here. I showed up to an interview and I was asked if I want the secretary job, right? How do we pull that person aside that did that and say like, hey, so when a woman shows up, don't just automatically assume that she's here for the secretary job, right? We need to be able to help give those people feedback so that it doesn't keep happening over and over again, because it really impacts your reputation. It's just an easy one, right, for fantasy football, right? Like, oh, my company, we do fantasy football, and all the men were invited. Like, why didn't they invite any women, right? So just those things where you can pull people aside and say, hey, so, just maybe invite all the women, right? There's no need to like leave them out. There are just some other examples that, real examples, by the way, that people shared with me on Instagram. I get used to bring in national clients who want diversity, and I think one of you mentioned, right, hiring people but not really leveraging their skills. Like this would happen a lot, right? Like when you're pitching to a client, right? Like, oh, we got to make sure that we have bios of lots of diverse people, and then they don't actually end up getting the meaningful work from that. They might help bring the deal in, and then they're like, okay, thank you, now go back to whatever you were doing. You need to apply that fairly and give them the opportunity. If they're helping bring in a client, let them like do the deal, right? Don't just use them for the visibility and for the marketing angle. I was offered half the salary of the job I applied for because I wasn't a breadwinner. This actually still happens in Utah. It's always shocking to me that men are given higher pay because they're breadwinners. And I will tell you that most of the women professionals that I worked with at the law firm were the breadwinner in their family. So I think this is going away, but it does still happen, so it is concerning. And it really doesn't have anything to do with who's the breadwinner, right? It has to do with what should equal pay be based on? Competence, ability, performance, right? Sorry? Time at the company, hopefully still tied to pay and performance. Yeah, so these things are slowly changing, but they're always good to be aware of, right? Being invited to lunch, all of that stuff. So this is what I believe an inclusive leader does. They value diverse thinking, they don't exclude others, they seek to understand their own bias, right? It's a very reflective process, being willing to acknowledge that where we can improve, and being humble enough to be willing to get feedback on how we can improve. And we realize that there's a lot of bias baked into process, and to be willing to challenge some of those processes. So this is just a final quote. When we think about, remember that original graph that I had where diversity is used a lot. What does it mean to be inclusive? And diversity is the art of identifying characteristics, right? So I can sit around this room and I can be like, okay, I can identify all these characteristics, but that doesn't mean I'm inclusive, right? So it's always good to track metrics, of course, but inclusion is actually the art of engaging people. It's a conscious decision to invite others' contributions without their characteristics actually mattering, right? Does it matter at the end of the day that there's an African American sitting across from me working on a team? Does it have to do anything to do with them being African American? No. It has everything to do with us having an interaction and a productive conversation to get the best ideas out of each other, right? Okay, so I think, yep, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, come on upstairs to 710. We'll do the Q&A. We've got Domino's Pizza.